Hello everyone, welcome to Talk of the Town. I'm James Milan, and today I am joined, we are very pleased to have in our studio our two state reps. On the far side is Sean Garballey, and right next to me, Dave Rogers, and we're here to basically get a legislative update, as we like to do and hope to be able to provide to you quarterly. Gentlemen, thanks very much for coming in.
Great to be here.
We really appreciate it.
You got it.
As we speak in early-ish February, we're just a little ways removed from the period in which you guys had to finish filing all the legislation that you're filing and the legislation you're joining as sponsors, et cetera. So I want to take the opportunity just to ask you both to pick one or two things, maybe three, to highlight among the, either the specific bills or the subject areas that you're most concerned with and about. Great. So in whatever order you guys decide.
Want to go first?
Oh, well, thank you, Representative. First of all, thank you to ACMi, and thank you to James, to you, for hosting us today, and thank you, Representative Rogers. We really do work as a team, and we're good, close friends, and it's a pleasure to be able to have a strong partnership and working for the people of Arlington at the State House. So as you mentioned, we're very busy this past couple of months getting our legislation ready and filed. Mine really focuses on kind of a bold vision for Massachusetts and how to move our state forward. And I'll focus on three of them. One is in the area of public higher education, to really address investment in the students who attend all 29 campuses of higher learning, from community college, state university, to UMass. 30 years ago, the cost of a student's education, 80% of it was borne by the state. And over the past 30 years, that's really shifted. The cost burden has shifted from the state to the individual student and their families. And to me, that is just wrong. Costs have gone up incredibly, fees, tuition, where the state really, in my opinion, has really walked away from their obligation to provide public higher education, which I think is a commitment that we made to the people of Massachusetts to provide K through 16 public higher education. So I filed what's known as the Cherish Act. We have about 120 co-sponsors in the legislature, and it would be about a $500 million investment to public higher ed for all 29 campuses and the students. And if we were to do that, we would hold fees and tuition flat for a 5-year period. To me, that's a commitment that we really need to make. The second piece of legislation I'm working on, Representative Rogers has been very active in this area too, and that's in the area of renewable energy. The federal government has really walked away in their responsibility to address the moral issue of climate change and the fact that human beings are responsible for it getting worse and worse. And we see forest fires getting worse, we see tornadoes getting worse, hurricanes getting worse. These weather patterns are becoming more and more severe. And really impacting our lives as human beings. And because the federal government has really walked away, states really need to go at it alone. The state of Hawaii, the state of California have passed legislation moving to 100% renewable energy. And I have filed a bill along with our colleague in Cambridge, Marjorie Decker, and Senator Jamie Eldridge, known as the 100% Renewable Energy Bill. Grateful Representative Rogers is a strong supporter of the bill, but it would move to 100% renewable energy by 2045 and try to figure out how to get there for the state to make our commitment. And I think it's something that we can pass. Senator Markey just unveiled his Green New Deal. Obviously, the state he represents should move to 100% renewable energy. And that's for a strong economy. It's job creation. It's for the future of Massachusetts to go in this direction. And James, the last piece of legislation I view as really a civil rights piece of legislation. I filed about 60 pieces of legislation this session. But the third one I will mention to you is in the area of public higher education as well for people with disabilities. So currently across the country and in Massachusetts, students with autism and Down syndrome aren't really allowed to go on to continue their education in one of our public higher ed institutions, and it works that way across the country. I have a bill that I filed with the Speaker Pro Tem of the House, Pat Haddad, which would remove the MCAS barrier for students with Down syndrome and autism and allow them to access public higher education. And the reason to do that is pretty clear. It's about outcomes. When you measure independence, when you measure their futures, students who are allowed to go on to public higher ed do a lot better. And I bring this up because we have close to 100 co-sponsors. We really got close to the finish line last session. I think we're going to be able to get it passed. We're meeting with President Meehan at the UMass campus to try to figure out unintended consequences. But to me, this is something Massachusetts should do to be bold. But thank you for having me on, and thank you, Representative Rogers, as well.
Yeah, and before we move to Representative Rogers, I just wanted to recognize that, because we've had the luxury of speaking to you regularly over the years, it surprises me not that among the many pieces of legislation that you filed, you chose to highlight things in areas that we know are high priorities for you: education, and the environment, and support for those with disabilities has been things we've often talked about before. So appreciate that. Representative Rogers, or Dave, if you don't mind
Dave's fine.
calling you that. I'm going to use Sean and Dave if that's okay. But sir, what would you choose to highlight?
First, thanks, James, to you and to ACMi. It's great to be here. It's great to be here with my colleague, Representative Garballey, or Sean. We're on a first name basis here.
There
right?
we go. It'll be easier.
And we do work together closely and in partnership to advance goals and to represent Arlington. And like Sean, I filed many bills, over 40. And so asked me to pick just a couple is hard. It's like, which of your children do you like the best, kind of a thing. But I guess if I had to pick a few, one is, if you look at all the priorities of what I would call progressive legislators in the House, whether it's Sean's higher education piece or improving our transportation sector and countless other priorities, we need revenue. And as your viewers may be aware, you and Sean be aware, that there was supposed to be on the ballot in fall of last year what was called the millionaire's tax. It was a surcharge on incomes $1 million and above of 4%. And we advanced it in the House. It had to be an amendment to our Constitution. Our state constitution actually prohibits progressive taxation like they have at the federal level. So we would literally need to amend the Constitution. So the House went into a constitutional convention and in 2 successive sessions advanced it to put it on the ballot. But a group of business interests who I assume are in part representing folks with incomes $1 million or above. And it's important to remember, it's income, annual income $1 million and above, not assets, because that would sweep in a lot more people.
Broader.
These are people who literally are making $1 million or more a year, formed a group, and they litigated the matter that it was improperly stated question to go on the ballot. Because it directed that the money go to transportation and education. And their point was only the legislature, with the power of the purse strings, has the authority to actually direct where the money would go. And unfortunately, they prevailed in their litigation.
Right, the Supreme Judicial Court.
The measure was kept off the ballot by the Supreme Judicial Court, a 5-2 decision. The 5 were Baker appointees, I might note. But be that as it may, the measure was defeated and prevented, I shouldn't say defeated, prevented from ever even going in front of the voters. And the polling on it showed it to be pretty popular. The thinking was it would probably pass if it made it to the ballot. But that leaves us with this challenge of, if we want to fund higher education, as Sean and the rest of us would like to do, and he's got a great piece of legislation to do it, we need revenue. And so I have introduced a bill that would raise capital gains rates, long-term capital gains. And that would mostly, frankly, There's a segment of our population that largely enjoys long-term capital gains. I don't know about you, but I don't have a ton of them
Yep.
lying around.
We're none of us in this studio at the moment.
And I have to say, I don't begrudge well-off folks their success and their revenue. I mean, their income. I never have. I don't believe that we're all in this together. But since we all are in it together, I think we do need to ask those who are enjoying the fruits and the benefits of our strong regional economy to help out with critical investments in transportation, education. So I have a bill to raise revenue. And it's interesting, I don't know if you saw this, Governor Baker actually proposed a tax increase on real estate transfer fees and suggested the money should go to climate change adaptation. And so my point there is we have the governor now, a Republican, willing to put revenue on the table in this legislative session. That's different than in any other legislative session in which I've served with this governor. So if putting aside the specifics of his proposal, to me, broadly speaking, that means revenue is on the table. And I think we need to raise revenue for so many critical priorities. So that's one important piece. It's, again, tough to pick a few. I have a lot of good bills. I hope my constituents will call me or contact my office. You can go to the legislative website and look at all my priorities. If I had to pick one, I have a bill to would direct the Department of Energy in our state to reach out to the other 5 New England states to investigate the possibility of forming an offshore wind regional compact with the theory that as wind power takes off more and more, Vineyard Wind, just that project is moving forward. That's 800 megawatts. We've authorized up to 3,200 megawatts. But other states are moving forward too, New Jersey, the Carolinas, and I think we should try to make New England the leader in renewable energy, in combating climate change, and specifically in this case, wind power. And so it would form a regional compact which would improve our purchasing power in the marketplace, sort of economies of scale. And I'm hopeful to move that. I filed that, and I'm working on that with a prominent environmental group here called the Environmental League of Massachusetts. So there's a couple things that I'm focused on.
Well, I do, of course, I want to acknowledge, as you guys have already, made abundantly clear, I know you're doing a lot of different things, and I know it's hard to pick just a couple to highlight, but obviously we've got time constraints, and we appreciate your cooperation with that. But the first thing that you mentioned is it's quite refreshing, quite frankly, to hear somebody actually speak about, I know this is something you're very conscious of, but somebody speak about raising revenue, because a question and a concern that we always have, ACMi representing, voters in Arlington or the population of Arlington, is how are we going to pay for stuff? And you guys have each been on the receiving end of that question from us on a number of occasions. So again, it's nice to hear that there are ideas out there, and I wanted to use that as a segue, in fact, to ask about any other options, and particularly the two that we've talked about in the recent past, being additional revenues that will be coming in through marijuana into the state coffers, and possibly through gambling, or whatever you'd call, casinos, et cetera.
Gambling.
Yeah,
Gaming.
exactly. Gaming. Thank you. That's more what I was thinking about. So just wondering whether, in the past when we've asked about this, it's been too early, in a sense, to get a sense of how much revenue there might be and how it could be earmarked, et cetera. But I'm wondering if there's any update on either of those revenue streams and what constructive good they might do in any of the programs that you've already mentioned or others that are important.
Well, I think the gaming revenue, it's a little too early to tell. We do have the slot parlors out on the South Coast. We have the MGM out in Springfield. By all accounts, that facility is successful. We will see what happens with the Everett Casino opening up, I believe, in June. But obviously, the gaming legislation that the House voted on about 8 or 9 years ago did earmark specific revenue to education and other items around addictive services. So we'll see what that looks like. But as Representative Rogers has stated in his outstanding bill, certainly one that I support, revenue will certainly be on the table. And Representative Rogers mentioned the millionaire's tax that the Supreme Judicial Court struck down because of a technicality in the legislature, or the question itself, earmarking, where the funds of said revenue would go. There is a representative named Jim O'Day from West Boylston who's filed the bill as a legislative action. So we may take that up this session. So I think revenue is on the table this session, and I think that's something that our constituents support, as long as the revenue stream is progressive, taking into account people's ability to pay, and adequate. We passed a $500 million tax for transportation a number of years ago, and I bring that up because both gentlemen, myself and Representative Rogers, voted against it. And one of the reasons we voted against it was we believed at the time it was inadequate, and that the type of tax was regressive. And there's nothing worse to say to our constituents that we're going to raise revenue, but it's going to be adequate, and then finding out that it's inadequate, which is what that last piece of legislation found out in terms of investing in public transportation and infrastructure. So we will have that debate this session. It is still a little early to say what form it's going to look like, because we literally just filed our pieces of legislation. We had till last Friday to sign on to bills, but I do agree with Rep. Rogers that revenue will be on the table. But my parameters, as I said very clearly, James, is that the revenue be progressive, really looks at a person's ability to pay, and the second criteria is that it's adequate. And does that include a broad-based tax? I think it does. Does it include capital gains? Without a doubt. So we also have to try to get to 81. We have 200 legislators in the legislature, so we need to figure out where compromise can be reached. And that is not an easy process, but it's an important one, especially now with the Supreme Court striking down that initiative.
Well, yeah, and I would echo what Sean said. I mean, we're going to have gaming revenue. We're going to have cannabis revenue. That is a 6.25, our standard sales tax. That goes to the general fund. There's a 10.75% excise tax, and that goes to fund, that's earmarked for very specific things, including substance abuse treatment. And then local government can impose up to a 3% local tax, which many local governments around the state are doing. And then Airbnb. We just did an Airbnb bill. And so that's going to generate revenue.
So you did it on the state level, because
Yeah.
I know that municipalities are also looking at that kind of
That's
thing
right.
too, right?
We did it at the state level. It was pretty, I don't know, compared to some of the other things we did, I'm not sure it got the kind of media coverage that it deserved, because it was a heavy lift. It was a significant bill. It was, and then the governor offered an amendment at the end, at the very last minute, which threw kind of a twist to the plot. But eventually a compromise was reached, so we're going to have Airbnb revenue. But despite the gaming revenue, despite the cannabis revenue, despite the Airbnb revenue, it's not enough. And we really, this is something that's been debated. Activists around the state have worked on for years. There was the Act to Invest in Our Communities. There was Governor Patrick's bill that he proposed up to $2 billion in revenue. We did less than that. And now, as I said, the millionaire's tax was defeated, but I think revenue will be in play. There's so many things that we're pushing to get done. Improving our transportation system, improving the inequities in our statewide education system, and dozens of other things. And I see, when we do our state budget every April, a crying need in so many areas. I'll give you another example, and there's dozens of examples. I filed a bill to give low-income people facing eviction a right to a lawyer. So if you're accused of a crime and you're a low-income individual, you have a right to a lawyer under the Gideon decision from the Supreme Court. So you can be appointed a public defender. Well, how about if you're a low-income, a poor person facing other very significant life challenges, and you need a lawyer? We have legal aid groups around the state, like Greater Boston Legal Services, Cambridge Somerville Legal Services, but 2/3 of low-income people who seek legal help at a crucial juncture in their life. It's like not being able to get to a doctor. I mean, you know, if you're medically sick, you need a doctor. If you are legally sick, you need a lawyer. And 2/3 of those individuals are turned away. There's no lawyer for them. So that's another example, because we do fund in the legislature, we fund the Massachusetts Legal Assistance Corporation, MLAC, but we can't fund it enough to meet the need. And so I see this right across the board. We need to be thoughtful, we need to be prudent, we need to do it in an intelligent way. As Sean said, that's not regressive. We do want to be mindful not to raise rates too high to the extent it could tamp down economic growth or be a disincentive, as some might say, to invest if it's a long-term capital gain. But we need to raise revenue in this state. And we could squeeze every nickel of efficiency out of this state budget, every nickel of trimming costs, being more efficient, eliminating redundancies, and we're still not going to get to where we need to get without revenue. So we'll see.
Well, acknowledging that last point of yours, let me nonetheless throw one question out at both of you, and that is, can you imagine or identify any area in which the state could spend less money as opposed to more, or reapportion the money that it is spending away from anything? Is there any area that, as far as you know, would be a candidate for that?
Well, I mean, when we did transportation reform with this governor, Governor Baker, we did appoint a fiscal control board for the T. And I think during their oversight process, they found some inefficiencies and ways that the T could be more effective. So I think, particularly, I've always said, as a progressive Democrat, as somebody who believes in the mission of government to improve outcomes for people, to give people a better shot at achieving their goals in life, that we, as much or more than anyone, need to point out inefficiencies where we see them, because that just gives our critics ammunition. So I'm all for finding efficiencies, eliminating redundancies. I think it's very consistent with my overall philosophy of government, which is I think government has a huge and constructive role to play in giving all of us a shot at the American dream, if you will. But if we're going to hold fast to those core values and principles, we also have to be the ones calling out government inefficiency. Because again, that's what our critics look to. Oh, see, government would screw up a two-car parade. I found. But I tell you, I spent most of my career in the private sector. I'm a business lawyer, and I've been a lawyer for high-tech and biotech companies, been a lawyer for a traditional manufacturing company. There's a lot of inefficiency in the private sector, too. I've seen waste and inefficiency even in very well-run companies. Human institutions are not perfect. So it kind of irks me a little bit when there's some inefficiency that's found, and there's calls from some quarters that somehow that proves government itself is deeply flawed. I see it in the private sector too. So anyway, I hope that's helpful in answering your question.
James, we have a $40 billion budget every year, and our priority is always local aid and other priorities to support really the safety net in Massachusetts, the most vulnerable people in our Commonwealth. And I think part of that that deserves examination is every little piece of the budget needs to be examined for inefficiencies. I tend to agree with Dave in terms of the inefficiencies I personally believe are low, certainly would not add up to the amount of money that we're talking about. But certainly that's something that deserves examination.
If I could just jump in for 1 second. For instance, there was a study done of our welfare system, and sorry to interrupt very briefly. And they did find some inefficiencies in food stamps and direct cash assistance, but I think it was less than 1%. I think it was like, so it's not this vast sort of bureaucratic ineptitude that leads to vast amounts of waste. So, but anyway, sorry.
No, I appreciate that, and I agree. And I think every part of our budget needs examination. It's absolutely critical to our promise to the taxpayers. If we're going to deliver quality services, we need to look at every area, and that includes payrolls. Examining people who are directly giving services, like driving our buses and trains. They're doing the hard work, and they're not making a lot of money. But I'm talking about the folks at the high end who are making six-figure salaries. Those deserve to be scrutinized and examined. But something that also deserves to be examined is our expenditure budget, and we have looked at that. In my opinion, we have not done a good enough job at seeing where tax credits are going. From the Fidelity tax credit, there's a tax credit around prop airplanes. We spend billions of dollars in the expenditure budget, tax credits that are meant to create job growth and spur economic job growth in Massachusetts. Well, some of these tax credits have been on the books, James, for 4 decades. And we have not done a good enough job examining whether or not the promise of job creation for these tax credits have actually been realized. And so I strongly support looking at those tax credits, because as time goes on, right, with 2019, our priorities change as a society. And so you need to reevaluate where we are spending taxpayer dollars. And if those companies are keeping the promises that they made when they signed up on the dotted line to get said tax credit. I would much rather support implementing the full recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission to make sure we're properly funding our schools here in Arlington and Belmont and Medford and across the state than giving Fidelity a tax credit for hiring 40 people. It certainly needs to be examined, and I'm hoping this session will be able to do that.
Well, speaking about efficiencies and revenues, it's time for us to move from the context of the state and drill down a little bit on Arlington-specific issues.
Sure.
And as you are both richly aware, Arlington homeowners / taxpayers, right? Because as we all know, 96% of our revenues in this town come from property taxes. They're facing a double or triple whammy in a sense. And by triple, I'm referring to not only the debt exclusion for the high school and the override that we're all very familiar with, that's all coming up here in the next few months, going to be facing voters. But on top of that, the assessments that just went out, the new assessments, property assessments in town, in which we have spoken to the director of assessments about the fact that there was a 14% rise across the board or on average. And that's, like I said, a double / triple whammy for people, and it's going to really be hitting people in their pockets. Well, there's homeowners like myself, and it's going to hurt, but I can handle it. But there are a bunch of people in town, as I know you guys are familiar with, who are either because their incomes are not at the level that they need to be, or they are fixed in some way and not keeping up with expenses. Those folks are needing and looking for relief. Your thoughts for that part of your constituency?
So a few things. One, at the state level, that certainly will trickle down and support the town of Arlington and all of our districts, was the recommendation of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. and that was an analysis that was looked at. I was one of the sponsors of the commission. And what the analysis was said to do, or what the commission's role was to look at areas in education that the state really has walked away on its commitment to fund. The recommendations came out, not surprising. It's in the billions for money that the state really should be investing in, that communities are having to fund themselves. These are in the areas of healthcare costs, special education, low income, and English language learners. So there is a bill there's several bills that have been filed. One is known as the Promise Act. One is filed by one of our colleagues from Salem. The governor has filed the bill. There's a little difference in each of the bills, but the premise is that Massachusetts needs, the legislature, the government needs to keep its promise and invest more in Chapter 70 in public education, addressing those 4 costs. So my hope is that will certainly help Arlington in terms of those costs in the area of millions of dollars. I don't want to say extra, because these are areas that I think the state should have been funding already. My hope is that would certainly help if we can get it funded and the money sent back to Arlington, in terms of helping Arlington elected officials have that conversation in terms of putting an operating override on the ballot.
Yeah, and I agree with what Sean said. You can't completely divorce the two conversations, because policy decisions we make at the state level, whether we raise revenue, what we do with the Foundation Budget Review Commission's recommendations in terms of education reform, will impact revenue that's in turn shared with the state. The governor's budget is out. There's a really good number, actually, for Arlington on Chapter 70 funding, almost 20%, 17%, 18%. But this is a big issue, particularly for, say, elderly on a fixed income. They've been in town a long time, which is great to have that kind of, it's a rich community that way, Arlington, of longtime residents. We don't want them to be squeezed too hard. And, we've seen this massive run up in real estate, which, I'm sure there are folks in town who bought their triple decker, bought a 3-family or a 2-family for $50,000 or $80,000,
decades
25,
ago.
30, 35, 40 years ago. And now their home's worth, $1.5 million. And so the taxes are rising just because of the appreciation in value. And then on top of that, as you point out, the big debt exclusion for the high school. And, one thing that seniors can do, for instance, is apply for a property tax deferral. So depending on their income level, they can apply so that they defer their taxes until the home is sold. Whether that's because they're selling and moving to a different home, or if they pass away, their home is sold through an estate sale.
We just passed that legislation in a home rule petition that allows Arlington residents to do that, so it's a great thing.
Right, and right now the income limit is around $57,000, $58,000. I just introduced legislation this term to raise that to $80,000. So that's something that can be very helpful to seniors on a fixed income. But it's a big issue. I think we need to be mindful that there are certain homeowners who are feeling the squeeze. And that's why I think we need to raise revenue at the state level, implement the Foundation Budget Review Commission, and raise the rate at which you can take a deferral. And I hope to move that legislation.
Yeah, so you mentioned deferrals, which is something that we've discussed on this in other programs.
The interest rates are
before.
high, but they are an important resource for a lot of seniors.
Yeah. And in general, both of you, in responding to that, were talking about ways in which you can just basically increase the amount of money that is available for our local officials to then decide what to do with.
Right.
I'm wondering, though, and I won't belabor this, but ask one more question in this area, and that is, in addition to the tax deferral that you were just program that you were just talking about, are there any other ones that are currently in place here in Arlington that you particularly support, or are there ideas that you have for other ways in which some relief can be brought to those, again, most vulnerable to this kind of crazy discrepancy between rising prices but not necessarily rising incomes?
So I know there are communities like Concord that have done the idea of means testing for those over the age of, I think, 65. Arlington has not embraced that idea yet. I know they have a committee that's working on it. I believe it would require a home rule petition. And that would mean is the local government here would vote on a certain proposal, whatever it would look like, and then we would file a piece of legislation similar to what we did with the property tax deferral, and try to get it passed at the state level to support seniors. So, you know, as I've always said to the town manager, each member of the Board of Selectmen, you know, we are certainly here to help. And if they have ideas that require legislation to be filed, please let us know, have that conversation in town meeting, or among members of the Board of Selectmen, and then we would file that similar to, you know, looking at what Concord did with the means testing. And I think that's important, especially with just what you said, the assessments that just went out, quarterly assessments that just went out, but also, you know, looking at the potential operational override, the potential, you know, the vote on the rebuild of Arlington High. Certainly our job is to try to get as big of a check coming back from the Foundation Budget Review Commission, also trying to get as high of a percentage with the MSBA, Mass School Building Authority, on the state's apportion commitment of the rebuild of Arlington High. But we'll continue to work with local government to try to see what, you know, what they think will be best for the seniors here, and that's certainly something that we advocate for.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, there's the abatement program, which is tied to the senior circuit breaker formula. That's another avenue for people facing this dilemma. And I think, you know, it has to be noted, while it's really important and we need to be mindful of how we can help people facing these challenges, in some ways it's kind of a good problem to have. I mean, if you bought your triple decker for $50,000 30 years ago and you have a $1.5 million asset that you're holding, I realize it could put the squeeze in terms of the tax, and that's bad and challenging, and we need to be mindful to try to help people with the exemption, with abatements, with more revenue from the state. It's also kind of a good thing that Arlington's thriving, people want to live here, the schools are good, the improvement of the override and the debt exclusion for this beautiful new high school will help. It will also increase property values. So I think we have to say the good news too. Right?
Sure, absolutely.
I mean, you know,
We've often talked about this as a good problem to have in the way that you just said. But interestingly enough, you know, education in this town is a big part of what draws people here. It's, I think, proximity to Boston in a lot of ways, the fact that there's a lot of other things going for it, but also, as you said, the school system is strong, and that is drawing people in it itself. So two things I wanted to ask about that. One is fairly simple, and that is the latest figures for the new school have just come out. $291 million is a figure that has been proposed by the Select Board. Your thoughts on that, especially because I know you're also aware of other high school rebuilds in the area, and what their price tags have been, et cetera. What do you think? Is this?
So, you know, I talked a little bit about, you know, implementing the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission as a form of local aid. I think one thing that needs to be looked at in addition to that is the amount of money we spend on our school projects for the Mass School Building Authority. Right now we pay it, I'm sure you were going to say this, Representative, but we pay a penny on the sales tax, what goes to pay for construction across the state. but that was also when construction costs were relatively low. And so the amount of investment for the sales tax to MSBA has not increased as construction costs, per square footage increase costs have gone up. And I think that's something that really needs examination and action on behalf of the legislature. Maybe it's a penny and a half that we take from the sales tax, but the MSBA wants to do projects across the state to really help infrastructure in our local communities, but they need to get the resources to do that. I'd rather, our job is making sure the state aspect of funding Arlington High is realized. We've been active in trying to get Arlington High rebuilt for many, many years in terms of being active with MSBA on receiving Arlington High School to be in the pipeline. This is probably the project that I have followed the most in terms of the state commitment and getting us through the pipeline, and now trying to make sure that we get through the pipeline unscathed in terms of the state process. But my hope or my advocacy really is trying to make sure the percentage of the state investment is as high as it possibly can be. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the local decisions in regards to what the Arlington High is going to look like and traffic patterns, that really is a local conversation. Mm-hmm. So, but obviously,
so you stay out of it?
Well, I don't stay out of it. My job is making sure that the state money is there, and that it's significant, that it's a significant investment, and I take that role seriously. And part of that role is not nitpicking, how the buildings is going to look. Obviously, I'm a graduate of Arlington High. I have my preference, but my job as the legislator and Dave's job as the legislator from Arlington is making sure this school gets built with state investment. Because if the state walks away, you're looking at a serious amount of money that the state would walk away from. That's not going to happen. But part of the reasons that's not going to happen is because we're watching it so carefully and advocating it. I meet with MSBA once a week and talk to them to make sure we're going in the right direction, and that's important to me. So that's kind of our role in the project.
Yeah, I think we push for greater state funding, and to answer your question about comparable projects, this is actually in keeping with the price tag we're seeing in other communities around. I also represent Belmont. Belmont just went through this with the MSBA, with all the design, an incredibly complex, detailed process of town committees formed to advocate and to study and come up with a plan. And it passed their debt exclusion by 76 to 24. And I think it did so because what they realized is if you walk away from that state money, which is significant, now you have to go back in the queue and start all over again. And there are growing pressures on our schools. In a sense, the very thing that's making Arlington attractive and vibrant and successful as a community is also creating this challenge of putting pressure on the school system. The school's badly in need of repair and to be redone, I should say. And so it is comparable to what you're seeing in other communities. I think the final price tag on the Belmont school is very similar to Arlington.
Yeah, which is good for people to keep things in perspective.
Waltham's cost is well over $300 million.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my last question, I think, and that is, as you've just cited, Dave, again, the schools and education, such an incredibly essential part of the quality of life in any community, and we're enjoying that here. Well, where does that where does the excellence in the schools come from? Well, a lot of it has to do with, having adequate facilities, as we've just been describing, et cetera. But I think all of us would agree, perhaps I'm saying this as a former teacher, but all of us would agree that the quality of the teachers, that the quality of the instruction and education, the devotion, the ability for those teachers to focus on their work above all is a key to providing really high quality education. An interesting thing that we have heard here is that there are teachers at Arlington schools, and not a small number, who would like to be able to live in the area. It also applies to librarians at the library and other, town staff who would love to live in the town that they contribute so much to the quality of, and can't afford it. Now, you guys cited, and we're all concerned about elders on fixed incomes and programs that can help them out, we hope. But how about these particular constituencies? Just wanted to get your thoughts on the fact this crazy situation again, where teachers who want to be here and who are invested in the community in a very essential way, can't find the means, can't afford, basically, to live here. So,
Go for it.
So, there are several programs that we have worked to increase funding for, MRVP, RAFT, that has allowed, I know many teachers with families to move into Arlington or to come back home, if you will. But, in respect, it's a small margin. And so we need to come up with better ways around whether it's, inclusionary zoning or zoning reform that would allow, utilize different ways to, think out of the box to allow, with the goal being of making Arlington more affordable. And I know you have a piece of legislation you just filed that would accomplish some of this.
Yeah, I would, again, echo what Sean said. I think there are no easy answers, and it's not unique to Arlington. It's Lexington, it's Belmont, it's Cambridge, it's Boston. There's a lot of folks who are such vital parts of the community, without whom the community couldn't even function, and yet they can't afford to live there. And it's kind of a housing crisis that's developed not just in the greater Boston area, but all across America, really particularly coming to a head, I think, in the last 10, 15 years. I was just out in Seattle last year, and being a fairly talkative guy, I end up striking up conversations with folks I would meet, the Uber driver, the Lyft driver, all sorts of different people. And unbidden by me, without me prompting them, like 4 or 5 different people I talked to brought up the housing crisis in Seattle.
very dramatic.
Yeah, and one person pointed out that Amazon, it pointed to this, Seattle has a pretty substantial skyline. It said 1 out of every 7 square feet here in Seattle has been rented to Amazon. And then the high-tech workers who do have good incomes so it's created this bifurcation almost, or split of folks doing well, and it's part of broader societal trends with income inequality, folks doing well who can afford to live somewhere, and others who can't. I don't think there are any easy answers. There are a variety of affordable housing proposals before the legislature that would
Before the state legislature?
Oh yeah, to boost affordable housing. I think that's something that needs to be pushed aggressively, as we've done in previous legislative sessions.
The bond bill, the housing bond bill.
Yep, and then I think maybe we need to think creatively about first-time home buyer incentives, or student loan forgiveness for people who go into professions like this, which would help them with their debt burden. So it's an important issue. There aren't easy answers. There are a variety of things in the pipeline that might help, which we need to keep pushing.
So I mentioned a little bit about the expenditure budget, and that budget really deserves examination as the times change. Now with housing prices being the way they are, how about a tax credit for first-time home buyers or some sort of investment? And the way you would pay for it is obviously looking at some of the tax credits we currently have that were imposed 40 years ago that are currently not kind of yielding the kind of economic results that makes the tax credit, in my opinion, worthy. The Greater Boston Food Bank projected for the town of Arlington that 1 out of every 14 people don't know where their next meal is coming from. That is a very, very horrific statistic. And it gets worse as you move far out. In Medford, it's like 1 in 10. In Malden, it's 1 in 7. So, one of our roles as legislators is really looking at the safety net. And, a lot of that 1 in 14 number in Arlington, it's not poverty that you see necessarily. Sometimes you do, but it's not poverty that you necessarily see on our sidewalks, on our streets. It's behind closed doors, right? It's hidden, it's not talked about. People have a lot of pride, and they feel if they reach out for help, that is going to interfere with that sense of pride. Obviously not true, but that's the way that many families feel. So one of our jobs as legislators is kind of figuratively opening up those doors and trying to help those families stay in Arlington, afford meals and such. And part of that is addressing that safety net. What can we do to make Massachusetts a better place for families? And that's part of kind of a bold progressive agenda this session that I really hope that this legislature will focus on.
Yeah.
Well, mindful of the value of your time and appreciative of the fact that, again, that you carved out that time to be with us. Let me just ask you as a last question, whether there is anything that you wanted to mention that we haven't covered. It's been an extensive conversation, so there may be nothing that springs to mind, but I wanted to give you an opportunity, very briefly, to mention anything that you would like to, and we haven't.
Sure. I would say I want folks watching who are my constituents to know that I love my job, and I'm very grateful for their support. I have the same energy now that I did on the first day I was elected. We are serving at obviously an important point in history. Our federal government is in retreat on so many issues. And it's been, I think, a perilous time for many of us who care about our communities and the future of our state and our country. I want folks to know that at the state level, I'm fighting for the values that they care about. I think we had a very productive session last session. We did sweeping criminal justice reform. In the wake of the Parkland shooting, we did an important gun bill for gun safety. On and on and on down the line. We did an energy bill to promote more renewable energy. And I could list another 10 or 12 things. The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, a bill I introduced to protect women who are pregnant in the workplace. And there's studies now that that's maybe one of the biggest, if not the biggest barrier women are facing, or many women. We need to push harder. There are things that I wanted to accomplish that we did not last session, unfortunately. We fell a little short. But actually, it was a pretty good record that we compiled last time. And now we need to keep pushing for more, which I intend to do along with Sean.
Anything to add, Sean?
Well, I also love my job. I love serving the people of Arlington and Medford. I love being able to work with Dave and the legislature, really being the voice of families in Arlington and Medford. To me, this session's all about the legislature being bold. As you mentioned, James, there are many, many problems facing the people of Arlington and across the Commonwealth. People being priced out of their homes, their neighborhoods, having a difficult time affording to put food on the table. And we see that. I went to pay my excise tax, a few weeks ago, and the line was out the door with people who were complaining about the increase in their increase in the assessment. So this session for me is really all about being bold and having Massachusetts not reacting, but being a leader on innovative ways to help the people of Massachusetts. especially with all the pressures and the noise, whether or not we have a functioning government or not down in Washington, we need to have that in Massachusetts, and it needs to be bold, and the priority needs to be families and the people of Massachusetts. My door is always open, whether you go to my website, garballey.com, or you can call me on my cell phone at 781-859-7781. I'm easily accessible, as is Dave. We pride ourselves on representing the people of Arlington. There were a number of topics that we weren't able to get to, like the proposal of Governor Baker on increasing the fares of the MBTA, which I strongly am opposed to. But there's other issues we didn't get to that I hope if constituents do want to talk about those issues, they will pick up the phone and call me or email me or myself or Dave. But we're really hoping that this will be a session that we can be proud of, as we were proud of last session. But thank you, James, for hosting, and thank you to ACMi for providing this opportunity for us to be able to talk to our constituents. It means a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and it's there's always more stuff to talk about than we ever are going to be able to get to. But we appreciate both your candor and how well informed and energetic you are as legislators and representatives of our community. I hope our audience doesn't get tired of me saying this, but after every conversation that I have with our representatives in the state legislature, I feel once again fortunate to be an Arlington resident, fortunate to be represented by the two of you and Cindy Friedman, and I wish you good luck in being bold.
Thank you.
In the upcoming session, and we'll check in with you again next quarter to see how that's going.
Great.
So thanks very much.
Thank you.
This is Talk of the Town. I'm James Milan, and for our representatives Sean Garballey and Dave Rogers, I thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.